Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my MSI main bracket stage day number 3 overview and analysis video. We are here on the third day of the main bracket stage here of MSI, the top 8 teams at MSI. We're still in round number 1. We're still going over these day by day, but we are back on the daily grind. Surgery is healed for the most part. It's not perfect. I'm still obviously going to have some cuts in this video. You're going to hear me breathe a lot more because I have to breathe a lot more, but for the most part, I'm back to daily content. It's not going to be a problem anymore, and that means we get to cover these series daily now, and this was a pretty good day to start off with some daily content. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. Let me know what you thought was going to happen in this series, and did it live up to your expectations? Were you surprised by the way things went? I certainly think I'm going to expect some surprises from how things went. It didn't go as I planned, so I'm not quite sure if it was going to go as a lot of other people planned as well. There was certainly kind of a consensus thought for how day number 3 would go, and I certainly don't think it did that. If you want to know my thoughts on what I expected, I talked about it a bit at the end of yesterday's episode covering both days 1 and 2. You can check that out up in the iCard right now. Up there will also be the playlist for MSI. That's going to be every single play-in game. That's going to be the primer at the beginning of the tournament where I power ranked every single one of these teams, talked about their strengths and weaknesses as rosters, as, completed units, and, ranked all the players as well. So if you're interested in that, check all those things out up there. But today, we are just going to be going over day number 3. We're going to be going over the main series that we got, the third of the first round series, and then, of course, we will quickly be previewing the final first round series at the end. But if you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in that series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Like I said earlier, we're going to spend a little bit of time at the end of the video talking about our final upper bracket round 1 series here at MSI, but for the most part today is going to be about this series that took place on day number 3. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. You can already see it up on your screen. It is, of course, a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon. On paper, this series should not be close at all. Really, Bilibili should absolutely dominate them. There is an argument to be made, and it's an argument that I have made, that Bilibili is the favorite to win this tournament. I think that what we've seen from them in not only the regular season, but specifically in the playoffs, has just been the most complete of all of the teams. I think that they have shown the least amount of exploitable weaknesses when you put them up against a team like Gen G, who I think is the other S-tier team, and we saw them 3-0 Fnatic yesterday. There are a lot of similarities, but one thing that I think really stands out for Bilibili, not only is the aggressiveness. I think they're better in the early game than a team like Gen G is, even if they're not quite as clinical in the late game as a team like Gen G is, but specifically the player talent. You can really not point to a weakness on Bilibili in terms of where they are able to be exploited, even by the other best teams in the world, and I'm not sure Gen G has that. Pace has certainly been somebody that has concerned me, at least over the course of this year up until this point, and I'm not trying to say he's a horrible player, and I'm certainly not trying to say that he's going to lose Gen G games, but I just didn't feel that way about Bilibili, which is kind of what put them over the top for me as the number 1 team in my power rankings at this tournament. And, it's funny, because I've always been high on PSG, I've always been high on the PCS, I've actually been notoriously high on the PCS on this channel back in 2021. I think I predicted them to get out of group stage at Worlds, and I still kind of believe that they are a pseudo major region, and especially with them beating North America and consuming the LJL, consuming OS as well. There is a lot of reason to believe that the PCS is just as strong as it has been at any point in the last couple of years. I think this region deserves a lot more respect than just being a minor region, in the same way that, no offense, that the CB LOL and the LLA are minor regions. They're not on the same level. Even the VCS are not on the same level, at least in my opinion. I think the PCS has clearly proven that they are better than that. That being said, they are probably the weakest team here in the main stage of this bracket, if only because I think they do have some exploitable lanes, mostly top and bot, that I don't think are world-class. I think Aji's just an okay player. Even domestically, he really wasn't dominating at the PCS level. Now, he played better in the play-in stage than I was ever expecting. He actually won matchups that I didn't think he was going to be able to win. He did well in matchups that I didn't think he was going to be able to do well into, so maybe that carries over into the main stage, but Betty and Woody are a bot lane that I've never really felt super confident in. Like, Betty's just an okay player. Woody's a good player, I think, as a support. Maybe not a star, but he's just okay. Like, Betty is very much just okay. He's kind of coming back with his tail tucked between his legs after failing at the LPL level. Not really failing. The RNG stint didn't work, obviously. Goes over to Rogue Warriors and eventually Anyone's Legend. And he's like a bottom 5 80 carry in the LPL for a long time. He's just not a player that really excites me here. If you're looking for avenues where PSG can be strong, it's jungle mid. Junjia is the best quote-unquote minor region player in the world. He's somebody who I think, if he were in the LPL, could still make an argument to be around top 6 in terms of junglers in the LPL. He is that good. Much more in the vein of someone like a Peanut rather than someone like a Shun on the other side of this matchup where he's going to be super aggro, but still a really big positive. And Maple, I think, has been fantastic over the past year and a half, really, even past 2 years. When you go back to his final stint on TSM and then him going to the PCS, he was really good in all of those splits, and I think that that's carried over. He wasn't perfect in the play-in stage. That first series against FlyQuest was a little concerning, but he really bounced back, and he's a big reason why this team is here. All that being said, Bilibili's just better in every role. Like, even Junji and Maple, who are good players, it's Shun and Knight on the other side of this matchup. Arguably the second best jungle mid duo in the world. Elk and Honor, the best bot lane in the world. Bin is arguably the best top laner in the world. Like, you don't have an advantage in this matchup. You have to be able to get Bilibili out of their comfort zone, which I just don't think is going to happen. We've seen 2 3-0s already. I would expect this to be another one, but is that going to carry over, or is PSG going to surprise us in game number 1? Well, going game by game means we get to start with that game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And this was good. It wasn't perfect. It was just kind of good from BLG. You maybe wanted to see them be a bit more clinical, because this is a team that really shouldn't be neutral at 10 to 12 minutes, but we saw this out of Gen G as well. Sometimes you just give over early game leads. Sometimes you don't feel like you need to press every single remote opportunity that the enemy team creates, because you know that you just get one small opportunity in the mid game. All of a sudden the game gets blown wide open, and that's exactly what happened. This game was relatively even. BLG was slightly favored, 1 or 2K gold lead throughout like the first 10 minutes of it, but then you get this like 15-minute skirmish down in Bot River that just completely blows the game open for BLG. It's like a triple kill for Elk, and then you get a solo kill on the top side with Bin killing Aji, and the game is essentially over from there. Even with BLG making some mistakes down the stretch, not perfect positioning, not perfect macro from them, it was still more than enough for them to be able to overcome what PSG was able to offer out. This was kind of what I expected after 10 minutes into this game. You know, PSG did a good job to survive, and as this slower, more methodical, more macro-oriented team, it was good to see them kind of try to play that style, but Bilibili's hands diff just kind of came in clutch here, I would say. A player of the game in game 1 is going to go to Shun for me on the Jarvan. He was excellent in this game. I thought a lot of the ultimates were really crucial. He was able to get on the Lucian very consistently, and when it wasn't the Lucian, it was often the Talia as well, and it just made it a lot harder for PSG to actually be able to play these fights. They clearly wanted to play around Betty in the mid game, and they just never really had the opportunity to, because Shun was locking him down, and Elk could actually deal a ridiculous amount of damage in these games. He was playing the team fights really well, and that just made it a lot more difficult for PSG to actually do anything front to back, which obviously their comp kind of wants to do at some point. Not only that, but PSG made the grave error of leaving up Ahri this game. Knight's Ahri is unbeaten, I think, in its last 27 games or something like that. We've been talking about it domestically for a while. If you leave up this champion, you are asking to lose the game. I don't really know why you would leave it up. I don't think things like Renekton are more valuable as a ban than something like Ahri is on first rotation. And Knight made him pay. Knight was excellent on the charms throughout a lot of this game. Maybe he didn't have perfect positioning. I think there were some fights where he could have been a bit more aggressive, and some fights where he certainly could have been a bit less aggressive. But again, he was still very valuable, especially in the fights that mattered the most. Bin was excellent this game. Cassante continues to look like the best top laner at the tournament. And Urgot, you know, a pick that we've seen actually work in the play-in stage and work a bit so far in the bracket stage, more than I'm expecting, really get punished. Like, the Cassante really made that pick look a lot worse when you're not the better top laner in this particular instance. So Bin, Shun, Knight looking good. Elk and On were excellent. On made a spectacular play on Renata in one of the later fights of this game in the mid lane, where he flashes in and, you know, he gets like a 4-man ultimate, and that lands onto the Lucian. It completely blows up the Nami and makes PSG basically unable to fight from that point onwards. Team fighting is supposed to be their strength, but BLG certainly can counter on that front. And Elk was also excellent, getting that triple kill down early on in the game, really kept the Kalista relevant and made it so the fights were actually a lot closer to being 5v5s than they were to the Kalista kind of getting outscaled, which is something you would generally be worried about with this team comp. So credit to Bilibili. Perhaps they could have played a bit more clinical, like that's really the only word I can use, but for the most part, this was just a good game. I'm not going to criticize too much from them. And then for PSG on the other side, just not good enough. Like, the hands diff was definitely very clear in this game. Dead of the game's gonna go to Aji in the top lane. You know, like we've said, we've seen Urgot work for a couple of teams at this tournament, both in the play-in stage and in the main bracket stage. It did not work for PSG in this particular matchup. If you're gonna pick Urgot, you do have to actually be able to be good. Like, you have to be able to play 1v1 into your opponent, and Aji is not good enough to do that into someone like Bin. And again, it's not really like a huge negative towards Aji. Like, I'm not super high on Aji, but Bin is that guy. Like, Bin is that dude, and Aji's just not that guy. And so I'm not surprised to see this go so poorly for PSG, but it wasn't just him. I think Maple could have been significantly better this game on the Taliyah. He's a really big swinging point, I would say, for PSG, probably the biggest they have on their team. Junji is a player that I really value and that I think has been good basically every game PSG has played, even in their losses, and Betty and Woody are generally fine. They can win if they're given resources, but if Maple is winning, if Maple has pressure in the mid lane, this team plays a lot better than when he doesn't. They don't really know what to do when Maple has to play from behind, and that was once again clear here. The moment Maple started losing super hard in the mid game, the moment he didn't have that shove and roam potential that Taliyah generally has, all of a sudden PSG's big macro advantage ends up crumbling around them. So, you know, I'm not shocked to see the solo laners really struggle here, but that's going to need to fix itself. Like, Aji just needs to survive on the top side of the map, and Maple, quite frankly, needs to be able to go up against Knight. And I know that's a big ask. Knight is at minimum a top 3 to 5 player in the world right now, even if you're super low on him. And Maple's just not that, right? Like, he's never finished above like 7th in the LPL, and so you're not expecting him to be able to go toe-to-toe with a player like Knight, but he's gonna have to if PSG want an opportunity here. I think Junji is good enough. As much as I love him on Maokai, and as much as I do think it is his playstyle, maybe transition him into something that can be more aggro in the early game, give him more tempo, give him more agency to be able to make some plays. We saw what Jun could do when he was actually able to really be the first one in a lot of these fights, and Junji didn't have that same kind of affordability. And then Betty and Woody were fine as primary carries here, but I would theoretically like to see that switch to Maple in order to try and maximize what your team is good at. But for Bilibili on the other side, just keep doing your thing. Maybe clean up your early game a bit. If you can win a lot faster, that's going to feel a little bit better. You don't want to keep PSG in this series. That's going to feel like a bit of a disappointment, but 1-0 is a good start. You want to go to 2-0 just like everybody else, though. Can PSG tie up this series and win a game 2 for the first time all tournament long? You know, with all of these teams losing their game 2s, we got 2 3-0s already. Are we going to get our first 1-1 series, or is BLG going to continue the trend? Well, the winner of game number 2 was PSG. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece. And for the first time, we've got ourselves a 1-1 series in round number 1. And for it to be this series, I was not expecting that. And honestly, if you turned off this game at 15 minutes, I don't blame you. This game was over. Like, BLG had this in the bag. There is literally no excuse for them to lose this game. This should have been the easiest 2-0 start to a series of their entire lives. And they threw this away. I mean, they threw this away by making a horrible decision in topside jungle that just ended the game for them immediately. It didn't really end the game, but it gave all of the momentum to PSG. It gave Baron to PSG. It gave them all of the time in the world to scale up on their scaling comp with Cassante, Maokai, Aurelion, Sol. And then all of a sudden they started winning fights. And you know what? Like, that's gonna happen. This really isn't a game that I'm going to freak out too much over unless we see it replicated. If Bilibili continues to make mistakes like this as the series continues to go along, that's when I'll start to get a bit concerned. But this in isolation is like 2 major errors back to back for Bilibili that took an unlosable game to a losable game. Like, you know, it is what it is. It happens every once in a while where you see something like this. But let's give PSG all the credit that they deserve, because they were great in this game. You can't just be a team that capitalizes on bad decisions and bad mistakes in order to win a game against BLG. You have to be setting up those bad decisions. You have to be forcing them to make those bad mistakes. And that's exactly what PSG did. They put them in really tough spots. And, you know, credit to them. They did exactly what they needed to do in order to get themselves back into the game. Player of the game, no brainer to me, is going to go to Maple in the mid lane. This was a top tier level performance from Maple. And it's exactly what we were talking about after game number 1. This is a situation where, like we said in the first game of this series, this team relies on Maple to win team fights in the back half of this game. I like Betty. I like Woody. I like Aji, who had a great game here. Junji is their best player, but at the end of the day, this team is at its best and its most successful when they are able to rely on Maple to win front-to-back 5v5s, and that's exactly what he was giving them in this one. The Aurelion Sol was immaculate. He was constantly doing like 1 billion damage in a lot of these fights. We know what happens when Aurelion Sol starts to scale out of control. Once they got that first Baron, all of a sudden souls on 3 items, and this game becomes a lot easier to be able to win. You know, we'll talk about his lane opposition in a bit. I think Knight was pretty good in the early game and then pretty disastrous as this game continued to go along. And Maple, quite frankly, just outplayed him in a lot of these fights. Now, the champions are definitely a bit different in terms of what level of execution you need in order to get the best out of them, but still, like, Aurelion Sol was very valuable in this game, and that's something you cannot take away from what Maple was able to do. He wasn't the only good player. I think Aji was excellent in this game, talking about how the solo laners needed to step up. That's what they did in game number 2. Aji on Cassante was a lot more consistent, and something that we've seen super commonly over the course of this tournament is that Cassante is just the best top laner in the game. Bin was really good on Renekton in the early game here. Like, he was solo killing everybody, constantly dominating lane, surviving a lot of engages coming in from the side of PSG. Like, they could not deal with Bin's Renekton, and I understand why you might want to take that away, but if you can get yourself Cassante early on in a draft, take that opportunity. I'm at the point where I'm starting to look at this as a pretty clear-cut B1 for a lot of different teams, just because of the sheer amount of consistency that it offers you over the back half of games. Specifically, a team like PSG that does want to play for slower, team-fight-oriented games. Cassante's perfect for that role. He can lane swap, he can shut down the early game, you can play that 1v2 style and just hope to be more relevant in the back half, and that's exactly what he was. Betty and Woody were also very good here. The Lucian Nami suits them very well. I would expect them to continue to go to this so long as they want to keep going to this. Elk and On were fine on the Kalista Renata. We'll get to them. They were not the problem for BLG, but Betty and Woody were by far not the problem for PSG. In fact, some really good team fighting from Betty when he wasn't getting caught out in the mid game. And then Junji is just excellent on things like Maokai. Again, I would still prefer to see him on something that has a bit more agency, but Maokai is probably his best champion, at least in terms of his production professionally over the course of his entire career, and we're seeing why. Like, if you can get to the teamfight stage of the game for PSG, that's their bread and butter, and they can beat you in that regard. So credit to them. This is a win that I don't think a lot of people were expecting, and they've already done better than some other major region teams in round number 1. But for Bilibili, disaster has struck here in game 2. You need to be able to course correct as quickly as possible, because you do not want to go down like 2-1 in this series, and especially because you were up like 10k gold in this game. I don't know if it was 10k, but it was closer to 8k, like at times in this game. Like, you had a dominating lead at 15-20 minutes and you threw it all away. Especially because of that, you need to lock in and you need to get like back on track. Whatever the hell happened with you taking those Hex Gates to try and catch out, quote unquote, catch out members of PSG in the upper jungle only to get 5v3'd. Like, you gotta clean that shit up. I understand this idea that you feel like you're the better team and you feel like you can hand stiff. Why leave it up to that? Why not just try and take the safe plays? Why not play the best League of Legends that you can play? This is not the Bilibili gaming that we saw in the LPL, and it's really disappointing. Knight's gonna get done of the game here. His team fighting was really bad on the Orianna. Constantly out of position, the damage just wasn't there. He was getting caught first in a lot of these fights, and that's just unacceptable. I think Shilin also had a much rougher game on the Jarvan. I understand wanting to go for the combo, but it didn't work in this one. Bin was good. I think Elk was good. I think On was fine. Like, generally, I'm not going to sit here and criticize the rest of this team too heavily, because I think their early games were all so good that it's really hard to be like, oh, they played horrible, because you don't get an 8 to 10k gold lead on accident. Like, this is what's supposed to happen in this series. Bilibili is supposed to be the team that beats them early, because that's how these two teams are supposed to interact, but PSG being able to keep themselves in it, battle back, and capitalize on mistakes, that's something that is going to be monitored. What's going to happen in game 3? This has all of a sudden become maybe the most important game of round number 1 up until this point. The winner of this is going to be in a much better position, and if you lose this, if you're BLG, that is disaster mode. Like, that is panic mode fully. You cannot walk out of this series with a loss. So game 3 is very important. Who's going to take control of this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to retake control of this series by going up 2-1. And I still don't feel great about what happened in game 3, but this was certainly much better than what we got in game number 2. Kind of the opposite of that, where PSG actually did a good job of trying to be mega aggro in the early game, tried to get their bot lane as ahead as possible, just perma-dove bot over and over and over again, almost to the detriment of their own team, because they gave up resources not only mid and top, but jungle gave up a ton of resources. Jungle was behind in levels, and even on top of that, like, they weren't even really able to get all that much in the bot lane, and so I understand the idea behind wanting to invest in that, but you get to this mid game, you get to 10, 15 minutes, and you're in an okay spot. You're at a relatively even gold situation. Betty is in a really strong state because he picked up a double kill in the mid lane, and he's playing out of his mind on the Zeri in this game, and so you're actually feeling pretty good moving into the later half of this game, considering, quite frankly, you've been the team that's better at team fights throughout this series up until this point, but that trend stopped here. Once we got to those 5v5s, once it just became kind of a mechanical diff thing, like Bilibili was like, screw it, we're not messing around anymore, we're not playing around, let's just win the game. Like, let's not worry too much about it. You know, Junjie, Maple made some pretty critical errors as this game continued to go along further, and Bilibili took advantage of those, so credit to them. Player of the game is going to go to Knight in the mid lane. He was not good in game 2. He was very good here in game number 3. I wasn't concerned that Knight was going to continue to be bad throughout the rest of this series. I just was a bit sad that game number 2 happened at all, because it's really kind of out of character for Knight to not play well in any game. Like, he's not somebody who takes games off, and so, you know, I was a bit disappointed to see the Orianna really just not kind of click for me, but this Taliyah game was excellent. The seismic shoves were perfect. The damage output on him was ridiculous, and he was there every single fight that they needed him to be. His macro presence was just insane, and quite frankly, he was driving the game for BLG. I know some people are going to point to maybe some other players on this team, like Shun, like Bin, who were very relevant in this, but to me, Knight was by far the most relevant for Bilibili, especially in terms of, like I said, the macro that this team wanted to go towards. Shun and Bin were also good. I'm certainly not going to try and, like, undersell them and undersell what they did. I thought the Wukong was fine, certainly better than the counterpart. He was way less active in the early game, which is generally what you're going to be as Wukong into Vi, but that ended up paying off, because the longer this game went, the more the Wukong was actually able to just kind of do his own thing, and Vi was investing a lot of resources into getting onto the wrong members of the team for PSG. So, you know, credit to Shin, he was just better in fights, and K'Sante continues to look excellent. I mean, what else do you even really want me to say at this point? Basically, every single game that this champion has been played at this tournament, it has looked ridiculously strong, and there were times where Bin was completely running this game, just as there were times where he ran it in game 1, where Aji ran it in game 2. Like, K'Sante just is going to open up more doors for your team. It's the best top laner in the game, and it's not particularly close. So, top side of the map doing their job. Elkin not perfect. Elk in particular, not great in this game, which was certainly a bit concerning. The Lucian didn't look nearly as good for BLG as it did for PSG, and we'll talk about it. Betty's actually playing the series of his life right now against BLG. This is a guy who has been okay at the LPL level in the past, but went back to the PCS because he just couldn't quite cut it at the LPL level over the past couple of years on bottom tier teams, and so for Betty to be really stepping up here, that's huge for PSG, and Elk needs to match him. Like, this is supposed to be the best bot lane in the world. That is not translated so far in their first international series, but they have good enough players to be able to overcome that anyways, and their macro was much better towards the back half of this game, which allowed them to pick up the win. And then for PSG, like I said, honestly, mid-jungle duo was the one kind of letting them down, which is certainly not the scouting report on PSG. Junjie and Maple, they're the two that kind of got them here in the first place, Junjie in particular, but, you know, we've talked about it. When Maple does well, this team wins. When Maple doesn't do well, this team loses, and that kind of carried over here. Some botched Nigo ultimates, that first one down in the bot lane when they continuously were trying to dive Elkin on, where he just completely misses it. Like, he flashes in and just, like, whiffs it. Like, no dodge from Elk at all. He just doesn't hit the Nigo ultimate. That's tragic, and even outside of that, every other ult felt completely inconsequential throughout this game. Maple did not play well, but Junjie, I think, was making more consequential errors where he was actively going on the wrong targets. He was prioritizing Nami, he was prioritizing Lucian, just never prioritizing Taliyah, never prioritizing trying to lock up the Wukong. Just very weird decision-making from Junjie, and that's usually not his problem, so he's going to get dead of the game for me. Really did not like how he played. Aji continues to struggle on this Urgot into K'Sante matchup. Whatever he saw in scrims, it's not quite working on the main stage, and that's definitely got to be a bit disappointing. But again, the positives for PSG so far this series are the bot lane. Betty and Woody have been really good. The Lulu was very consequential, if only because the Zeri was popping off in this game. Betty is playing the series of his life right now, and if he keeps that up, he's going to make things interesting for PSG regardless of what happens on the rest of the map. If you can get good performances out of Maple, maybe moving back over to blue side, getting him back on something like Aurelion Sol, if they are going to be able to leave it up for first rotation, maybe getting Aji that K'Sante again early on in draft. Like, these are things that I think actively could move PSG into a good position in this series, and that's not something I thought was possible. So credit to them. They're still playing their hearts out, and they're still playing well, but at least in this game, Bilibili definitely did have the hands and the macro advantage. Is that going to carry over into game 4? Are we going to see game 2 as a bit of an outlier, or is PSG going to shock the world and bring us to a game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was PSG. They are going to take game number 4 we're tied up and we're going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. Are you kidding me? I did not think that this was possible going into this series. I didn't think this was even in the realm of possible outcomes. Even if you could have convinced me that BLG was going to take some time to rev up, that they were going to play a style that, let's just say, isn't quite as clean as what they were able to play domestically, and even if you were also able to convince me that PSG was actually the best play-in team, like, especially of, like, the minor regions, like, they're better than EU, better than NA. Like, if you were to convince me of both of those things, which I don't even know if either of those things are true, but let's just say for the hypothetical argument that you convinced me PSG is better than every team from EU and NA, and BLG was going to be pretty bad to start this tournament, I still would have thought this was like a 3-1. Like, this is still ridiculous. This is still an unbelievable outcome, and you got to give all the credit in the world to PSG Talon for being as good as they have been. Player of the game, no brainer. It's gonna go to Betty in the bot lane. I said earlier he's having the series of his life. Well, that has continued here. Flashwolves Betty is back. Like, I don't really know what else to tell you. Like, obviously this guy's had some good performances in the past, but remember, he was kind of the young blood on that Flashwolves team back in the day. He was the one that was replacing veterans on Flashwolves, and the question was whether or not he could step up and be a consistent player for that team. He was really only around for kind of the last couple of years of the LMS dominance, and then he goes over to the LPL to play for RNG, and it just never gets better for him. But returning to the PCS, returning to kind of the region that started it all for him, it was good, and he was okay domestically, maybe not elite, but good enough domestically. This is maybe the best I've ever seen him play. Like, mechanically, this is a top 5 in the world kind of performance on Ezreal. I mean, truly, this was ridiculous what he was able to do in this game. I cannot overstate enough just how good he was at being able to dodge pressure, at being able to output a ridiculous amount of damage. He hit every single ability that he shot in this game, and he was dodging things left and right, and it was just beautiful. Absolute perfection from Betty. He's been the best player on PSG in this series, and that's not even debatable for me. The rest of this team was also good. Woody has been tremendous. He was really good on Ashe here. This was a champion he was doing super well on in the play-in stage as well. I expect Ashe to be a consistent presence for PSG if they allow it in draft moving forward, because Woody just seems super comfortable on the champion. That's actually something we've seen in the LPL. There aren't a lot of AD carry, like, support duos. There are not a lot of bot lanes that like playing Ashe support in the LPL. There are a lot of other regions that obviously have really kind of indexed into it, but the LPL has always been a little bit lower on it than other regions, and a lot of that I think is because LPL supports are much more engagers than they are, you know, enchanters or facilitators, but Woody, certainly somebody who can abuse that Ashe support, and we've seen this bot lane dominate this series so far. Junjie was excellent in this game. You can talk about some mistakes that he made in game number 3. He bounced back immediately in game 4 to be a pivotal driving force for what PSG was able to do. Maple was excellent, especially in some of the last fights, at being able to pick out prime targets, you know, pieces like Knight, pieces like Elk, to be able to hit them with seismic shoves. Again, when Maple plays well, this team just kind of wins. And Aji got Cassante. By the way, Cassante 4-0 this series. I'm not going to sit here and try and make it all about that champion, but Cassante 4-0 this series, and it's not really all that hard to see why when you watch the tape. This was a very good draft from PSG. They got a lot of the things they're comfortable with. Sedge plus Talia, one of the most consistent duos in the entire game. Betty got comfort with the Ezreal, and Woody got comfort with the Ashe as well. And you were able to just kind of play your own style and tempo. You didn't have to win early. You got to play it a little bit slower because BLG wasn't pushing the tempo with their comp, and so you ended up in this situation where you could just kind of do the things that you're good at, and you won the game because of it. You're moving to a game 5 now. Anything can happen in a game number 5. I'm not saying you're going to be favorites going into that, but it's not impossible for this team to walk out of this series with the biggest upset that we've had in many years of international competition. And then for Bilibili, disaster is on the horizon. I mean, it's already kind of disaster, right? Like, losing 2 games against PSG is already kind of disaster in your home country of China here at MSI. It's just not looking good, man. Bin goes for the super aggressive counter pick on R5 in the top lane with the Vayne. It kind of works. Like, the Vayne is relevant, but is the Vayne relevant enough to be able to carry this game? No. It was never going to be in a position to do that against, like, Sejuani plus Talia plus Ashe. Like, there's just no circumstance in which Vayne ever actually carries this game, and so you're relying on your carry duo here of Knight and Elk, which you obviously can do. They're on Azir plus Xayah, which I think is a super reliable duo, but unfortunately, neither of them play perfect in this game. Elk is a pretty clear choice for dead of the game for me. I think some people are going to want to give it to Knight, but I actually think Knight did a lot of good in this game as well. The bad moments will stand out. I think there were some positioning mistakes and obviously some engages that he just simply shouldn't have gone for that were way too aggressive, way too risky, and really didn't need to happen. But I think for the most part, his positioning was actually super good in a lot of these fights, and so I really don't want to criticize him too heavily. I am going to criticize Elk, though, for just not being good in this series. He has been the worst of these 280 carries, and I was loud and proud about how I firmly believed Elk was the best AD carry in the world right now, and the way that he had been playing in 2024 was the best AD carry in the world right now, and it's just not translated so far at the start of MSI. Shun also was not particularly good on the Vi. Again, a champion where if you're not pushing that tempo, if you're not pressing your lead and advantage, especially into something like Sejuani, you're just not going to be as useful in the late game. Yes, you have point-and-click knockdown or lockdown, but who is that on the enemy team? Ashe? Like, who are you ulting as Vi here? Ezreal? Like, okay, he's just gonna wait to get hit and then dash away. Talia? Okay, she's just gonna put her ground down and she's gonna flip you backwards. Like, who is the target here for Vi? This champion is not as good as everyone wants to make her, out to be. And I think this is something that the LPL in particular could really struggle at, because they really like Vi, and I've been a champion of Vi being overvalued, and we're seeing kind of the negatives of that here. On also getting picked off pretty early in some of these pivotal fights. That's not ideal. This is just not looking good for Bilibili. It looks like they're at minimum even with PSG, which is a disaster. That should never be the case, but all the credit in the world to PSG. No matter what the outcome of this series is, they have done everything to prove to people that they deserve to be here and that this region deserves to be considered higher. We'll talk about that a bit more after game number 5, after the series is over, when we get to these like grand talks about everything as a whole. But PSG has done some phenomenal things for the perception of the PCS, and they could do even more if they win this. If they win game number 5, the entire narrative changes. So here we go. Silver Scrapes, game 5, winner take all. Who's going to win it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to avoid the biggest upset that we've seen internationally in I don't even know how many years. Like, this would be one of the most crazy moments of the modern era of League of Legends, professional League of Legends, that is. But they avoid it with this win. They are moving on to the second round in the upper bracket. PSG, of course, not eliminated. They're just moving down to the lower bracket now, which was anticipated all along. But what a fight. What a series from PSG. We can talk about game 5, and we will. This was a slaughter. This was never close. This was BLG saying, all right, you had us on the ropes in the first 4 games. We weren't, given even 50%. We're going to give 100% because we want to win this series for game number 5, and we're going to win this in 23 minutes, and it's not going to be a 23-minute game. This game was over 5 minutes in, and you're not going to have a shot, but I mean, credit to PSG for making it this far. That is truly an accomplishment. They have looked the best of any team that has lost so far at this tournament by a pretty large margin. Like, they have been significantly better than both Liquid and Fnatic in terms of how they played out their series. So you got to give PSG a ton of credit for that. And against maybe even a better opponent in BLG, the PCS is definitely a region that you have to take seriously now. But for Bilibili, they avoid eternal ridicule by not losing this series, and they just barely grab it from the jaws of defeat, which is good for them. Player of the series and player of the game for me here in Game 5 is going to go to Knight in the mid lane. It's going to be a bit controversial. I don't think Knight played perfect in this series. I think their losses, he was actually not great. Like, Game 2 was pretty bad from him. I was very critical of his Orianna in that second game, and I don't think he was perfect in Game 4 either. I think he was probably a little bit better than people are going to give him credit for, and I do think he was the best player in both games 3 and 5, and that's why he's going to get player of the series for me, because I think when you're looking at 2 of the 3 wins, he was probably the most influential player in those wins. But you can definitely look at Shun in this game for Game 5 as player of the game. You could look at him being super active in game number 1 and say that Shun could get player of the series, and I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to say, all things considered as well. So whether you want to give it to the jungler or the mid laner here, I think it's kind of up to personal preference, but I'm going to give it to Knight because I do think that the Nico was just a little bit more impactful as this game continued to go along. He was consistently hitting 3, 4-man ultimates as he continued to move forward in the game. Definitely a bit of a difference from what Maple was doing, I believe, in game 3, where he was just not hitting anything with Nico. So definitely a bit of a difference when you get a really good Nico player, but this game was out of control super early on. Shun was abusing Aji in the top lane for a majority of the early game, and then eventually you just got to these like skirmish settings, and you get to fighting over Herald, you get to fighting over Void Grubs, and things just get out of control really quickly when Bilibili wins all of these fights. Yes, they got the Herald stolen against them, So what? It turned into literally nothing. They couldn't even take a tower off of it. It just didn't matter. There was literally nothing that could stop the BLG train from rolling out of control here. Elk and On had their best game of the series. Elk was only caught once, and it was in the back half of the game, and he still had flash up this time, and so he actually got to survive the engage. On was really good on the Ashe, and Bin definitely was part of the reason that Aji got dominated so much in the top lane alongside Shun, so good stuff, I would say, overall from Bilibili. Did you want to see better stuff from them across this series? Absolutely. You did not want to see this go to 5 games, and there are real question marks about Bilibili moving into the next couple of rounds, but one of the things that does give me some confidence that this is more of an outlier is that the way that they lost was a bit of an outlier. We've seen Bilibili lose games before, not just this iteration of this team, but last year as well when they had Yagao instead of Knight in the mid lane, but otherwise the same 4 players. They lost in very different ways to what they were losing against PSG Talon with. Like, this didn't feel in character. It didn't feel on brand for them to lose in the way that they did, and I think that leads me to believe that this was more of them taking this series off rather than something that I think will be repeatable. Now, they could potentially go up against T1 in the next round and completely shit the bed and just have a really poor MSI performance. I think that's realistic. I think that's possible. That's within the realm of possibilities after how they played today. I just don't know if I'm willing to give up on this team like everybody else after one bad series. I think that there is still, a lot of things that we need to see out of them in a negative capacity against teams that they do respect and that they are going to take seriously before I just completely give up that BLG can still be a tournament favorite. But for PSG, I'm going to have this conversation, and I know a lot of other people are going to have this conversation, but we're at the point where it's been multiple years now. The PCS is a Big 5 region. Like, there just kind of is, especially with the LJL being in there now. You already had OS, yeah, depending on what happens with Vietnam, who's to say they're not going to be joining soon? That region's falling apart, and so the PCS has turned into a region that you simply have to take seriously, and the fact that they get 1 rep at MSI is ridiculous. The fact that they get 2 reps at Worlds, I think, is ridiculous. I think this should be a region that maybe doesn't have the same, top 4 status as the other top 4 regions, although after this performance, people are going to say, oh, PCS better than NA, because everybody likes to clown on NA, forgetting the fact that NA was better than EU for last year in terms of quote-unquote results, even if the regions probably weren't better when you watched it with the eye test, right? NA is still deserving of a top 4 status. That's a ridiculous claim to make, but the PCS deserves to be in a tier of their own above, the VCS and above the CB LOL and above the LLA. They are clearly tier above those regions. They are too good of a region to be stuck where they're at right now, and I think PSG is a great example of that. Unfortunately, this draft just isn't it for me. The Udyr really rounds out a comp that I think is way too passive and way too slow. Viego plus Azir plus Senna means you have no aggression in the early game, and I get that plays into your strengths as a PSG team, but especially with Betty being able to carry you throughout a majority of the series, having the series of his life, taking him off of anything that can be mechanically intensive in any way, it's not ideal in my opinion. And I think Maple had a pretty poor game. I think Junji couldn't really do anything, and Aji, like we said, he's done of the game. He got abused on the top side, was constantly ganked by Shun in the early game, and then was just useless. I don't really understand how the Udyr fits into this comp at all. Woody was also pretty bad on the Tom Kench, was able to survive a bit, but man, he did absolutely nothing as this game continued to go along. But again, this was more of an outlier with this series than anything that kind of became the norm, which is the surprise. The fact that they were in this and they were so competitive for so long is more shocking than the fact that they got blown out here in game number 5. And so, they moved down into the lower bracket. Now they're playing either G2 or T1, likely G2 if things go according to plan. It's not going to be an easy series for them. G2 is a pretty highly regarded team, and they're definitely on the hard side of the bracket. If they played Team Liquid or Fnatic, I think there would be real talks about them being favorites in those series, especially with how they played here, but I just don't believe that this tournament run is going to be big for them. They're going to look back on this series as the highlight of the tournament for them, and rightfully so. This was a highlight for the region as a whole, and I hope it does cause some change. I hope it does cause some movement, but I don't really think it's going to take them further than the first round and the first couple teams eliminated here in the main bracket. But again, for BLG, you just simply have to be better moving forward. I know we're talking about a team that won, but they should have won harder. We need to see the Game 5 version of Bilibili throughout the rest of this tournament. I still think that's realistic. I still think that's a possibility. Maybe I'm too optimistic. We will have to see. I'm not willing to write this team off after one best of 5. Whatever happens in that next series, that's really going to determine which version of BLG becomes the real one, if you will. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Main Stage Day 3 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated MSI bracket. Bilibili moves on to the upper bracket, round number 2. PSG, unfortunately, falling down to that lower bracket, but let's quickly go ahead and talk about what we can expect to see tomorrow, day number 4, the final upper bracket round 1 series that we have, and in my opinion, the closest on paper. It's going to be G2 taking on T1. I think this is a very fun matchup. G2's actually had T1's number historically speaking, which is definitely not, I think, what people would expect, but those prime G2 teams were regularly beating T1. You know, Mickey X famously undefeated against Faker, and so definitely is going to be more interesting as a series. I think G2 is the best team that isn't kind of the big four coming out of the LPL and the LCK, and I think a lot of that has to do with Caps being by far the best player in the West, and really the only player I've seen so far this year that I think can compete on the same level as like Eastern teams right now. If Caps is playing at 1,000,000% and is just better than Faker, G2 can win the series. Like, it is really that simple, and I don't think that that's impossible. I just don't think that that's probably going to happen. T1 should win this series. I would predict T1 3-1. I think G2's good enough to get a game. I think T1 could fumble a game here or there. They have weaknesses. You know, Zeus in the top lane is inconsistent. There's bound to be 1 or 2 games that he just doesn't perform well in. They could still win those, but you know, I think G2's good enough to capitalize on that. I think Owner is bound to have a couple of bad games here or there throughout this tournament. I don't know if that's going to be in round number 1, but like, it's not, T1's not this unfathomable, unexploitable team. Like, they have their weaknesses. I just think that they are more well-rounded, and I think G2's hopes rely way too much on Caps, who I think is going into T1's best player in Faker. So I don't think it's a great matchup for them. I think T1 should be able to take it, but let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Do you agree with me? Do you think T1 are favored? Do you think G2 are favored? And let me know who you think is going to be moving on between whoever loses tomorrow and PSG as well. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Do you think Bilibili has a chance of bouncing back? Do you think that they are as bad as they showed they were here today? Do you think that's going to be replicable over the course of the entire kind of MSI run here? I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you enjoy the video, leave a like on it. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're posting about every single day of MSI here on this channel, so if you're interested in comprehensive overviews daily, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.